All right, so while all that is going on economically, we're also starting to see a lot going on socially. And World War II becomes a very important period of change, not just in the world at large, but also back home in America, as a lot of different groups are kind of undergoing some significant changes. They're going to change their status and kind of just change how society is going to view them. And this is going to be one of the more important things that come out of World War II, at least as far as the AP exam is concerned, because they've had this question a lot. In fact, this was an essay question one year, about 7, 8 years ago, that just how did World War II impact different groups in society? And they gave you 4 groups, and you had to pick 2 of them and just talk about how the war impacted them, meaning, these are the things that changed, these are the things that didn't. But it was actually a pretty good essay question and wasn't too hard as long as you obviously remembered the stuff. That's often how it goes with an essay. So we'll go ahead and start by talking about women. So women, obviously, prior to World War II, had over a 50% unemployment rate. Birth rate was declining, divorce rates were declining, so just a lot of things changing as a result of the Great Depression. But during World War II, we're going to see a significant change afoot. And it begins with mobilization for the war when you need all the labor sources that we needed. And so you see this Rosie the Riveter campaign that becomes famous that's meant to encourage women to get involved in the war, specifically into the war industries, where she's wearing the factory outfit, the blue collar shirt. Um, so they were trying to recruit women to work in the heavy industries, obviously to replace the men who are off fighting the war, so to speak. And large numbers of women do get involved in the war effort, especially in the labor in the industries. Just personal story. My grandma, I remember, was in college during this time, where she didn't join the military. She would go to her classes during the day, and then at night, basically for every year she was in college, she would then go to a factory in Columbus, Ohio, where she would sew parachutes. So she'd go do all her homework, and then she'd get home, eat, and then quickly go to work and spend 6 to 8 hours sewing parachutes. And her story would be very similar to a lot of women's story in this time period, as they were just people everywhere were going in to chip in at all the ways they could. And so this is going to create this scenario we're going to talk about a little bit after the war that's going to start laying the groundwork for the later feminist movement. But one mistake not to make: a lot of people, like if they're writing an essay on like the development of feminism, which gets asked frequently on the AP exam, they'll talk about, oh, well, Rosie the Riveter came, said we can do it. Women went to work, and then when women got fired after the war, they all said that's wrong, and feminism began. Whereas that's not really the whole story, and it's not totally accurate. But we'll go into more of what the accurate story is later. All right, another example of change that we're going to see back home is the change going on in the black community. So I mentioned before the Great Migration, the second one in this case, where over 1 million people are moving north. And so that's obviously going to bring a lot of change as people are moving from rural to urban settings, and they're also moving to new locales. Still going to northeastern cities, still going to midwestern cities, but we're starting to see a significant number of African Americans moving to the West Coast, moving to cities like Seattle or Los Angeles or Oakland, because these are all big centers for mobilizing for the war in the Pacific. And so the black community, which traditionally there wasn't much presence of it on the West Coast, we're now going to start to see a lot of people from the black community living in the West Coast. And so this is going to start to just kind of change the makeup of American society. And it's also going to, create the frictions we see in World War I, where some people living in those communities aren't happy about the black community moving in. Other people are going to resist, just the changes going on in the workplace. But either way, it's going to create a lot of opportunities for people as well. Okay, and we're going to see riots. Some of the most famous race riots that are occurring in this time period occur in Detroit, where the actual story of it's kind of sad, but what ends up happening is a fight breaks out on the way to an amusement park, where it used to be this amusement park that a lot of the white families in industrial working class Detroit would go to on the weekends. Well, a lot of black families are now living in Detroit, and they had the day off too, and so a lot of black families are trying to go to this amusement park. And some of the customers from the white community saw the members of the black community marching across this bridge or walking across this bridge to go to this park, and you just see some of the tension that had developed boil over to where they start attacking some of the black families, and then there's violence across the city. And this is how race riots begin sometimes. And out of that, comes, as you can see, police are arresting people frequently People get arrested that aren't necessarily the perpetrators of the crime. But this is the kind of stuff that we see in America anytime, sadly, these demographic shifts occur, as people are just slow to adjust to the change. All right, another very, very important example of what's going to happen in World War II that plays such an important role down the road for the black community is going to be the rise of A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph, there's a picture of him right there, was the founder, one of the key founders of the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters. That was the biggest union in the United States, labor union, that was predominantly African American. As a sleeping car porter was traditionally a job. It's kind of like the server on a train car, if you're familiar with that. If not, then you're not familiar with trains, and that's okay. But they're called porters. And so the sleeping car porters traditionally was a job that was held by African Americans. And so the union, the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters, was a huge organization, predominantly black men that were porters. And so because, I mean, they were a labor union, so predominantly they were there, for getting workers to be treated better. But every single member of it was black, in which case it also kind of functioned as a voice for the black community. And A. Philip Randolph was willing to use that. So what ends up happening is the discrimination that was going on in the workplace was a problem. There was tons in these war industries that we talked about under mobilization, where a lot of these factories, they are desperate for workers. They're hiring women, they're hiring people from Mexico, they're hiring black workers, they're hiring anybody they can, and yet they're not treating these workers well. They're not treating them the way you would think anybody should treat each other, much less people that they desperately need. And so A. Philip Randolph is going to approach FDR and say, hey, Roosevelt, we need to fix this. You need to ban this kind of discrimination in, if not America at large, at least in the war industries, because these are industries you directly oversee as the President of the United States. And FDR kind of tried to push back and say, I don't want to do that because it'll offend conservative Southern Democrats. And so, maybe I can do something different. But A. Philip Randolph doesn't want to hear that. He's saying, no, this is wrong. This needs to stop now. I'm representing my union. I'm representing the black community in general. We need to do something about this. And what he's talking about, like in the aircraft industry, the industry that actually built airplanes, like fighter planes for the government, there were over 200,000 employees. And I'm pretty sure the statistic was only 6 of those 200,000 were black. And that's a problem, because if you built airplanes, that was actually one of the higher skilled jobs, and so it paid pretty well too. And yet even the 6 workers out of the 200,000 that were black, all 6 of them worked low-end jobs within that industry, like a janitor or a custodian, so they didn't even have access to that. And so that's the kind of stuff that Randolph is saying, hey, FDR, we've got to cut this out. And when FDR tries to say, nah, I can't really do that right now, I got to win World War II first, then we'll come back and talk about racial discrimination. That's when A. Philip Randolph then threatens, if we can't do this, like if you can't do this, then I'm going to put pressure on you. And he says he's going to create a march on Washington, where he's going to get the Brotherhood Sleeping Car Porters and as many people as he can to march into Washington, D.C. and just have a big national protest, like we saw the Klan do in 1923. We saw Coxey's Army do in 1893 and 4, or 94 in that case. And then we saw the Bonus Army March in 1932. So basically just trying to raise awareness of issues. And FDR was saying, hey, I can't do this. This would create too much disruption of the workforce, create too much disruption of the economy, too much disruption politically. Please don't do it. And A. Philip Randolph agreed. I will call off the March on Washington if you agree to do something about this discrimination in the workforce, which FDR does do. And he does that by creating the Fair Employment Practices Commission, an agency that's now going to investigate accusations of discrimination in the workforce. And whereas this Fair Employment Practices Commission is not going to do a whole lot right up front, the fact it even exists is exceedingly important, because for the first time in a long time, basically really since Abraham Lincoln, we have a representative of the black community come to a U.S. president saying, hey, this is a problem. It needs to be addressed. And whereas like Teddy Roosevelt at least was good enough to like meet with Booker T. Washington and other leaders in the black community, he didn't do much in response to them. Whereas Abraham Lincoln obviously did. And now we're going to see FDR do something. He's going to create this Fair Employment Practices Commission, which again, it's not going to do a ton right off the bat. But the fact it even exists becomes a very symbolic and important victory for the black community, because they're starting to recognize the gains they made into the New Deal, the gains that they were experiencing in society, which again were limited, but they were there, are starting to now actually turn into government policy. And so this is going to become this important moment in history. A. Philip Randolph threatening this March on Washington, which prompts FDR to create the FEPC. That's going to re-stimulate the civil rights movement. If you remember, the civil rights movement was growing in the 1920s. The NAACP was growing in membership. But then in the 1930s, it sort of collapsed. The Great Depression just caused almost everything to collapse, including people's ability and desire to support things like growing awareness of civil rights, as evidenced by the massive declines in the numbers of members of the NAACP. But that is changing now that World War II is happening and these events we're describing are occurring. And one of the most famous examples of that is going to be when the group CORE is founded. That stands for the Congress of Racial Equality. And they're going to be a new type of civil rights activism group that's going to have a new approach to civil rights. So before we had the NAACP, and they were by far the most famous group. And the NAACP was a group that basically said, look, we don't want to do a lot of direct confrontation. We're going to do most of our fighting in the legislatures. We're going to do most of our fighting in the courtrooms and things like that. Whereas then we had groups like the United Negro Improvement Association, who they weren't honestly even supporting civil rights to a degree. They were supporting empowerment in the black community, which is a very important concept. But they weren't necessarily supporting integration or opening doors of opportunity within the white community and broader U.S. society in general. They, if you remember, were advocating things like Pan-Africanism and the Back to Africa movement, which I don't think a lot of us would say is quite the same thing as what we in the United States would at least describe as what civil rights and opportunities would look like. Whereas CORE, they're going to be a new style of group where they are going to support equality. They're going to support integration, kind of like NAACP does. But they're also going to be willing to use more direct tactics where they're going to go out and protest. They're going to go out and conduct marches. They're going to do what Henry David Thoreau would call civil disobedience, basically to raise awareness. And so CORE is going to be one of these first groups from this World War II and beyond era that use the methods that today we would all recognize as methods of the civil rights movement. Like if you're familiar with the March on Washington in 1963, or the bus boycotts in Montgomery, or sit-ins and things like that. That's the type of stuff that CORE advocated. And so that's the type of stuff CORE is going to do. Not that they're going to not do the other things, but CORE is going to be a group that kind of interprets the changing times where the black community has a larger role to play, that people's eyes are opening. You have a President FDR who's more willing to support these changes. And so CORE is going to start to be more open and more impactful in the way it approaches civil rights. And one of the most famous things it's going to do is going to push for the Double V campaign. And the Double V campaign, as you can see in this poster, is going to be kind of the nickname for this push for civil rights during World War II, where basically they want a double victory. Victory, hence the Double V. Victory at home over racism, right? Getting rid of segregation, getting rid of Jim Crow and whatnot. But then also victory over racism abroad, because remember, most of the countries we're attacking, whether it's the Nazi Germans, the Italians, or the Japanese, all build into their messaging, build into their government systems a lot of racist and racial superiority ideologies. So basically the black community, as part of this Double V campaign, is saying, hey, if we're fighting racism abroad, and we are, and we should be, we also need to be fighting it at home as well. And so this becomes a very famous moment where basically the civil rights movement is going to restart following the Great Depression. And this time it's not going to stop. It's going to keep growing until it eventually leads, skip ahead 2 decades to the 1960s, to a lot of the laws that are in place today that have made things better. Again, our nation has a long way to go on that front. But the victories we have had in our past, in large part, is directly a result of this new shift in the approach of the civil rights movement that's taking place during World War II. All right, another group we're going to look at are people from Mexico, some of which are American citizens, some of which are just migrating here, and there is a large amount of that. And if you remember, going back to what's been happening in our society, that Mexican people started coming to our country in large numbers around 1902 as part of the Newlands Reclamation Act, where a lot of the land that's getting irrigated in the West is now arable, farmable, which means that we needed labor. A lot of the labor we drew from the Philippines, some of the labor we drew from Mexico. And so there were people coming to the country from Mexico that now were becoming American citizens or migrating here in an effort to naturalize and work in the American industries. Okay. But then, and we saw that rise in the early 1900s. We saw it rise in the 19 teens with the Mexican Revolution, which caused a lot of refugees to get displaced here. But now we're also going to see it happen in the 20s, as a lot of Americans just weren't willing to work a lot of the jobs in the fields of the Southwest. But then in the 1930s, if you recall from the last unit, we're going to see large-scale deportations of people from Mexico. Obviously not citizens, but a lot of the people that were brought here as seasonal workers or on seasonal visas, or people that might have migrated here without paperwork. And we're here, quote unquote, illegally. In which case, what we end up seeing is that a lot of deportations are on the rise, but now it's World War II and we need labor again. So once again, we have this, as the College Board would call it in their curriculum, we have this contradictory U.S. immigration policy, where on the one hand we're throwing people out, but on the other hand we're bringing them right back in as part of the Bracero program. The Bracero program is going to begin in 1942, and it kind of functions on and off again for the rest of our country's history. Where basically what the Bracero program is, even though it's changed names since then, Bracero is basically a word in Spanish that means somebody who works with their arms. I don't think it's actually a word I've heard, but it's kind of made into a word by a hybrid of two other words. But basically, it's a program where we bring in people on seasonal visas, where they're coming in the spring for planting season, and then they're going to plant, work the farms all summer, and then harvest, and then go back. And then we're going to do the same thing the next year, and the next year, and the next year. It is a means by which to bring people here to work so that we can have labor. And you're going to see a lot of people come here, but as we see, and sadly the rest of U.S. history, that whenever people come here in large numbers from new areas that don't necessarily fit in with our society, there's going to be tension that results from this. And probably the most famous example of this in the World War II era is going to be the Zoot Suit riots. Where in the Zoot Suit riots, we're going to see a bunch of violence aimed at people of Mexican and Filipino descent, but especially Mexican descent, sometimes aimed at African Americans, even though they weren't directly involved in the events that led up to this. But sadly, that's just something we see in U.S. history. So basically, the Zoot Suit riots began in Los Angeles, and it all starts because of this idea of the Zoot Suit. You can see a picture of young guys from Mexico standing there wearing these Zoot Suits. Zoot Suits were very popular amongst the black community in the 1930s and 40s, amongst the Mexican community in the 1940s, because they were basically just kind of oversized suits that were kind of cool to wear to the if you're going out to eat or going out on the town. And they were just fashionable for the time. I don't own any myself, but they were popular at the time, and they became a big deal. Now, the problem with the Zoot Suit is during World War II, we were rationing, and so there was a shortage of fabric and material and stuff like that. So when you saw somebody wearing a Zoot Suit, it did not help that America, which obviously had a ton of prejudice, racially speaking, they're not going to go out of their way to look at people that aren't Anglo-Saxon anyway and support them. And then B, you have the whole idea of the Zoot Suit, which is obviously in a period of rationing, this would be considered a surplus of material, a surplus of supply that did not need to be used. So you have the whole thing where racial prejudice exists, and then you have the whole thing where it looks like people are wasting material. And now we have this issue that creates this tension. And the tension is going to boil over when at a bar in Los Angeles, a town that was mobilizing for the war, a lot of soldiers were there at the time getting ready to embark on boats to go over to the Pacific. An incident occurs where, according to witnesses, some off-duty naval cadets, or not cadets, sailors, basically made racist comments towards some Mexican teenagers who then attacked them. So it turned into a fight at a bar. But then word breaks out that a couple U.S. soldiers got beat up by some Mexican teenagers. And so out of that comes just a bunch of people take to the streets and start looking for people in Zoot Suits, start looking for people that are either people of Mexican descent or Filipino descent or black, and begin to beat them up. And so in this example, you can see a couple guys of Mexican descent got beat up, and then whoever beat them up then took their Zoot Suits off of them and just left them in the street suffering. And there's a picture of people getting arrested during this time period. These were girls that were out protesting what was going on. They're of Mexican descent as well, and just saying that this is wrong. Eleanor Roosevelt even went out and made a public statement where she called this a race riot and said this was wrong and the U.S. needed to do something about this, which made her husband FDR very angry, as he did not want to have to deal with this. But either way, it shows us that as groups come to America, in this case, people, a lot of them coming from Mexico, which we invite them, the Bracero program, it does create tension amongst people that are not always so supportive of these policies. The next group we're going to talk about are Jewish Americans, a group that, obviously came here in large numbers. We learned about this earlier in the 1890s, early 1900s, for the variety of reasons that we talked about, the pogroms people were avoiding and whatnot. America is kind of a checkered past, needless to say, on the issue of how we treated Jewish people, because there was a lot of discrimination in America at this time. The KKK, as it rose up again in the 1920s, targeted Jewish people as a people group that they were opposed to, among many others. And then even in the early stages of the Holocaust, where, Hitler is in Germany is starting to conduct, making people wear the Star of David. We're starting to see the rise of the concentration camps in the mid 1930s. That a lot of Jewish people in Central Europe tried to come to America, and FDR frequently said no. There were multiple examples of ships filled with people of Jewish descent that were like coming to America, sitting in a harbor, and the U.S. would not let them come into the country, and so some of them turned around and brought the people back to Europe. And needless to say, with what we now know occurred in Europe in that time period, this is a pretty heinous thing, but it happened. In which case, what we're going to see during this war is that this actually becomes kind of a turning point, though, in how people of Jewish faith are viewed in American history, where up till this point there was a lot of anti-Semitism, which is the word you would use in this case, as the Jewish people claim descendant from Shem, the son of Noah. And so the people group that descends from Shem are called the Shemites or Semites, the Semitic peoples. So the hatred of Jewish people is called anti-Semitism. But in this period, obviously, there's going to be a lot of change. In large part, it is because of Adolf Hitler and what's going on in Central Europe with the Holocaust and whatnot. But it kind of opens up a lot of Americans' eyes to just how badly people from the Jewish community were being treated. And it caused us, not all of us individually, but it caused many of us in the country to really reflect on how we treated Jewish people as well. And it's going to raise a lot of awareness to how we honestly had our own issues in that arena, and that we needed to reflect on that. And so after the war, I'm not saying anti-Semitism goes away entirely, but you are going to see significant declines of it. And people of Jewish faith are going to join the military in large numbers and fight bravely. They were actually as a percentage of soldiers who served, they were the highest awarded soldiers as far as medals of honors, Purple Hearts, and all the other different awards you can get when you're in the military. As it just seemed like this war was a very good opportunity, I think, for a lot of groups. A lot of Mexican American soldiers served, Black American soldiers, women obviously served. But I think people from the Jewish community, a lot of history books would say, just felt there was a lot more at stake, which makes a ton of sense if you know anything about the Holocaust and all that. Really awful. There's not really words that can describe how awful it was, but it would give a lot of incentive to people from the Jewish community to really want to go fight back against that. And as all these things are changing and all these attitudes in America are changing towards Jewish people, we're going to see the rise in this time period of an idea called Zionism. Zionism is a philosophy that's kind of been floating around the Jewish community for several centuries at this point, especially the 100 years leading up to World War II. It's a philosophy amongst the Jewish community that basically longs for Zion, hence Zionism. Zion was the term from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, that refers to Jerusalem. It's like this symbolic mountain that Jerusalem sits on. So when you say Zion, you're kind of saying Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was the holy city of Jewish faith, where the temple was, and the temple was like the gateway to Yahweh. And so it was basically like the physical point of connection between Yahweh and his people. So so this kind of absence where the temple that Herod built was destroyed, and oh goodness, was that AD 66 or something like that? Or was it 120? All right. 2,000 years ago, roughly, the temple was destroyed. And when that temple was destroyed, then we also had the dispersal of Jewish people around the Roman Empire, as the Roman Caesars were tired of how the Jewish nation, the nation of Israel, would not worship the Caesar, how they were constantly this thorn in the side of the Caesar. And so they decided, all right, we will break up the nation of Israel and disperse them amongst the rest of the world, which they did, which is how so many Jewish people ended up in Europe. And then skip ahead 2,000 years, we've seen anti-Semitism for the last 2,000 years come and go in different waves. Like during the Black Death, the bubonic plague, there were a lot of communities that blamed the Black Death on Jewish people, going all the way back to the late Middle Ages when all that was happening. And so there was a lot of violence aimed against people there. We obviously had the much more recent examples of the pogroms that we talked about in like the late early 1900s, especially in Eastern Europe and in Russia, which prompted a lot of the people that came to our country from the Jewish community to come here. And so out of all that, out of this dispersed population group, where people in large numbers are basically, Jewish people are not a majority anywhere. They're a minority like in every nation they lived in as a result of that dispersal. And so basically the Zionist movement, it almost sounds a little bit like Marcus Garvey's Pan-Africanism to a degree, where it's saying like we need our own homeland. We need our Zion back. We need this area where we will be the majority so that we can then live life the way we would choose to live. We can practice our religion the way we choose to live without, all these examples of being attacked. And obviously, I probably don't need to point your attention to how World War II would be an exceedingly famous example of that, with the Holocaust and Hitler's final solution and all that nonsense. Just that, again, horrible event leads to there were roughly 18 million Jewish people in the world at that time, and roughly 6 million will be killed during the time period where Hitler's in charge of Germany and conquers much of Europe. So this is obviously just a humanitarian crisis on proportions the human brain can barely comprehend, if it can even comprehend it at all. And so basically out of this just kind of eye-opening experience, we start to see a lot of support for Zionism amongst the American Jewish community. So if you remember, the American Jewish community was largely driven by people that were fleeing from Europe to come here. Well, now we're starting to see more and more people in America from the Jewish community say, well, maybe we need this Zion, the thing that was already big in European Jewish community, this Zionist idea. It starts to become bigger in America, and it's going to become so big that our government will actually respond to it after the war, when they, along with the United Nations, and we'll talk more about this later, are going to develop the nation of Israel, in which case the nation of Israel will be put back in where the Middle East, near the Levant, the Eastern Mediterranean, where the province from the old Ottoman Empire Mandate of Palestine, which was the name the Romans gave it back in the time period. It was a Roman province. And needless to say, without diving into all this right now, that's going to be a issue of debate. And a lot of people have very strong views on that on both sides. And we'll just obviously present it as it's happening historically. But just know that the movement that gained that kind of support in large part is going to be coming out of the experience of the Jewish community in World War II, and just the changing attitudes of Americans to the Jewish community. And this movement was kind of, probably its foremost leader was Louis Brandeis, the Supreme Court Justice, who Brandeis University is named for. And he was famous for the Mueller versus Oregon court case. And so with that, we need to move on. But at the end of the day, this is going to be a very important turning point in the role that Jewish Americans play in our society, and the impact they are going to be able to have. And then we get to the last one, very famous situation, infamous, probably a better word for it, where we see what happens to Japanese Americans. Now, the irony is the Japanese people living in our country during this time period, by and large, were all American citizens, frequently second or even third generation, because if you remember the 1906 Gentleman's Agreement, people from the Japanese community generally weren't migrating to America after 1906. Well, it's now the 1940s, meaning it's been almost 35 years, which means most of these people are first, second, or third generation migrants, which means a lot of them are more assimilated, more Americanized, so to speak, than they are not. In which case, Japanese Americans are going to be here in large numbers, hundreds of thousands. Yet, as soon as World War II breaks out, with Pearl Harbor happening, people are going to overreact and just assume anybody of Japanese descent is a potential enemy. And the problem with that is, Japanese soldiers actually serve very bravely. A lot of Japanese soldiers, people that are American citizens but of Japanese descent, are going to fight so bravely in World War II that they're actually going to win lots of medals and stuff, but we would not let them fight in the Pacific Theater. We generally sent all our soldiers of Japanese descent to the European theater to fight, because we were just concerned that they were conflicted in their allegiance, even though there's no data indicating that anybody was. That was just the prejudicial view we held at that time. And so because of that, we're going to see the rise of the internment camps, where basically our government announced, Executive Order 9066, we're going to start creating these internment camps, these camps by which we're going to take people of Japanese descent and put them in them for the duration of the war. Even though most of these people had never committed a crime in their life, they were innocent of all things, and they're basically being thrown in minimum security prisons without a trial, just simply because of their race, simply because of their ethnicity. And so this becomes a very problematic thing for Americans, not just the fact that it is so prejudiced, it obviously is, not just the fact that it violates constitutional rights we guarantee to all people, which it obviously does, but also the economic consequences it has, as these people lose tons and tons and tons of assets and resources, because a lot of them lose jobs, lose positions of influence, lose homes, lose property, because they can't take enough stuff with them. They can't sell their houses quick enough before they go to these camps. And obviously, you're going to struggle to pay a mortgage on a house you own while you are in jail. And so a lot of these camps become so problematic on so many levels for people of Japanese descent, yet we do them. Okay, and here's some pictures. These are the newspapers advertising that these camps are being started. Here's a picture of the most famous of these camps. This is Manzanar. It was huge. You can obviously see in the picture. If your brain is telling you, doesn't this look a little bit like a concentration camp in Europe? Yes, it kind of looks a little bit like it because they're kind of similar facilities. Very different outcomes. Like our camps are never used as the death camps that the Nazis will employ. Not that that makes this much better that we're doing it, but we're still, using similar methods to concentrate this population, fearing that some of these people were potentially enemies planted here by Japan. Here's people getting processed into these facilities. As you can see, people getting dropped off in trains and all that. And then there's a family waiting to be picked up to be taken to their camp. Okay, this was a picture of a house on the West Coast. And I'm not proud to say that this was an American who put these signs up, but it's a picture that I think does a good job of showing us the prejudice mindset that existed in this time period. Okay. There's a picture of some kids in the camp. A picture of a family eating a meal during life in the camp. Okay, Dr. Seuss cartoon mocking us for what we're doing, where Dr. Seuss is basically saying, do you really think all these Japanese people that came here 40 or 50 or 60 years ago are just waiting for a signal from the Japanese camp to come pick up a bunch of dynamite and blow us up? And yet, the way many American citizens were acting, that's kind of what we assumed, which is very sad. There's a picture of a family arriving at the camp. Notice they're trying to show that they're patriotic American citizens, but that did not work. And those are not peace signs. Those were victory signs. That doesn't become a peace sign until the 1960s. There's a kid who grew cabbage in his camp. And then a family obviously packing up all their belongings to take to the camp. And so these were just scenes from these camps. Now, one of the most famous examples of a response to these camps is going to be in Korematsu versus the U.S., a Supreme Court case that you learn about in civics. If you took a government class, you learn about it in government. So I'll just quickly detail it. Basically, it was a lawsuit saying Japanese people didn't do anything wrong, so it's violating due process to put them in these camps. But as you should remember from your civics class, the Supreme Court says, no, that's not actually true, because during times of war, our constitutional liberties are limited. And in this case, they say that this is an constitutionally acceptable way to limit civil liberties during times of war, as it's prioritizing security and safety over people's liberties, which most people today would look back on this case and have a problem with it. But it should not surprise us, as you should know at this point, as we've already had World War I, we've already had the Civil War, that during times of war, people's civil liberties always get limited. That's just a byproduct of war. It's not necessarily a good thing, but it's a thing that should be expected at this point. And so this will be probably the most famous example of that from World War II.